How's everyone doing today? My name is Yupari, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 6 of my Realist portrait painting series. This week, we will be starting a new painting and focusing solely on the drawing and the values. I will only be using my flake white replacement and raw umber. I use regular old bristle brushes for my initial marks, but as I go on and develop, I like to use a Princeton Catalyst Polytip Bristle Brush. It's a mixture between a soft synthetic and a rough bristle brush. For my mediums, I'm just using, to the left of my cup, regular odorless paint thinner, and to the right of my cup is a 1/5 stand oil to 4/5 paint thinner mixture. Stand oil is a thickener, paint thinner is a thinner. So I like having that kind of consistency where the paint isn't too runny, but it's also not too thick. When I begin, I like to place my top and bottom most portions of the head. This is just to give me an idea of the placement of the head in space. I like to know where things are going to fit. Using just a few lines, I like to encapsulate the whole outside shape of the head to just a few simple shapes. These are just so that I can get an idea of the placement of the whole structure of the head in space. I think that in the beginning of any painting or any drawing, it's important to loosen up. It's important to just start with something, make some marks, and just go with it. Don't be so timid that you're afraid to make any marks, and it's the end of the world if you place the axis of the eyes in the wrong place, the axis of the nose. No, you shouldn't do that. You should be free. You should be able to make marks and look at them, stand back, and adjust them. Keep things as simple as possible so that when you stand back, you can see where you are and you can see how you can adjust them from there. But just don't be afraid to start loose. As far as technique right now, there are three things that I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the placement, that is the top and bottom, left and right, most portions of my big shapes. I'm focusing on the big shapes themselves. What are the characteristics of the outside shape of the head? And I'm focused on the proportions. I have some lines indicating the axis of the eyes, the axis of the nose, and a mark for the mouth. These are general shapes. These are general approximations that I'm using, just using my eye. That's how I like to start. I like to start just using my eye, no measurements, and feel my way around the portrait as I place big shapes relative to one another. We want to work general to specific. We want to be able to start with something that we can make into a specific shape later on. I'm going ahead and mixing up a value for the shadow of the face. I'm not trying to make a straight dark. I don't want to use my raw umber right away. So I'm making a kind of middle ground that's slightly a little bit darker than, say, the middle of your value scale, so that I can lay in the value of the shadow side of the face and still have some room to put some darker marks so that accents under the ear and then the dark mass of the hair later. I still want to be able to have a larger spectrum of values to work from. While I'm laying in this large mass of paint, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the consistency of the paint, which is something I don't often talk about. I like to keep my paint rather on the more fluid side. I don't want it to be completely thick, like just straight paint by itself, but I don't want it to be too runny either. So that's why I use a 1/5 stand oil to 4/5 paint thinner mixture. I feel like it's a nice combination of medium to paint that allows the paint to flow a little more easily. Stand oil is also a slow dryer, while other mediums are fast dryers, like say liquid. Um, so using a little bit of stand oil in my medium is going to make the paint stay wet a little bit longer, which is actually beneficial to me because sometimes I work like 6 hours a day on a painting, a commission, or a large figurative painting, or whatever. I like it particularly because of that property that it keeps the paint wet for longer periods of time. I like to use something I call an eraser brush, so it's just a clean, slightly used up bristle brush that I put in paint thinner, pat on some paper towel, and I use it to push the paint around, kind of like an eraser would do to charcoal, just to carve out more specific shapes. But in this case, I'm just using it to move up the shape of the nose, and then later I'll be using it to draw out the outside shape of the face a little more accurately. It's important with this eraser brush, however, to pat away as much of the paint thinner from the brush as possible because it can kind of get messy if there's too much paint thinner on the brush. And it could drip across the surface, which is alright. It's a painterly effect that some people use sometimes, but if you're going to use that effect of paint dripping off the surface that you're painting on, it's best to do that intentionally. Now I'm going to be mixing up the first value that's going to be introduced to the light side of the face. I'm going to be mixing up a value that's lighter than the previous value of the shadow, but I don't want it to be completely white, so I'm going to be mixing up a value relative to the value of the shadow. Definitely lighter, but not completely to the white side, so I want it to be a value that's dark enough that I can separate it from the shadow, but I can work on top of later to adjust and refine the value. With this value I've just mixed up, I'm very simply just using it to carve out more exacting shapes for the light side of the face, and that's all I'm really doing at this point. I'm just using this value to help me draw out the form shadow of the side of the face a little better and draw out the angle of the nose, as that's a very important aspect to a face that's mostly in profile. And that's about all it is at this point. I'm just trying to use this color value to simplify and get my forms a little more exacting. Now, as you can tell, I'm going to be going one up lighter in the value scale for the face. I'm doing this sort of in an alla prima approach, even though this is a start of a painting that'll work on later. I'm just going to be building up the values on the face and making a structure, three-dimensional structure in space. Now this is a alla prima trick. If you haven't seen my alla prima portrait painting videos, I'll link up my latest alla prima portrait painting tutorial. But this is primarily the technique that's used in painting alla prima. But in this case, I'm using it to give myself more of a three-dimensionality to this monochromatic underpainting. And then once I have the light portions of the face completely painted in, then I will start to refine the drawing a little bit more. So far I just have primarily three values on the face. I have the light and the shade, and then I have the planes that are turning into the shadow, so you can call them the side planes. You can see one clearly on the nose, you can see another clearly in the eyes, and then you can see another clearly on the side of the face. So those planes are pretty much unified into the same value just for simplicity's sake. I'm making this monochromatic underpainting because I feel that my previous videos on the start of realist portrait paintings might have been a bit confusing to people because I was painting in color. Even though I was using color, I was telling people just focus on the value, focus on the value. And I even tried to create a filter where I would show the painting in just monochrome. And I personally found that to be probably a bit confusing. So that's why with this one, I'm completely starting it in monochrome. Just value, so you can see that it's value primarily that gets most of the work done uh, in terms of drawing and structure. As the value scale grows on the palette, I will be introducing yet another light value on the light portion of the face. And this is again to build up the three-dimensionality of the face in space. And again, I should reiterate what I've mentioned before in the start of a realist painting. The important thing is to get the light and shadow shapes, the placement of the features in space, and indications of the form. Right now I'm creating the indications of the form by mapping out large planar relationships. You can see the forehead is carved out into some planes, as well as the cheek and the nose. But I'm not trying to render, I'm not trying to make anything look completely finished yet. I'm just trying to feel my way around the forms as I place the features on the face. Now I'm taking a little bit of the raw umber into the middle value, and I'm going to be drawing out the more specific shape of the eye, her right eye right now. I'm making a mark for the leftmost portion of the eye, the topmost portion, and the rightmost portion relative to you. So there is a point existing now on the leftmost portion of the eye and the rightmost portion of the eye, and I've made finite marks for these placements at the moment, and I'm going to be making these placements and stepping back periodically and relating these placements in space to one another. The eyebrow is been placed, and the corner of the eye, I just used my brush to create a horizontal line to relate the angle at which her right eye makes to her left eye. Now she is in perspective relative to me, so the left eye should be a little bit lower, but not too low. It's a very specific angle at this point. It's important to use horizontal and vertical lines periodically when you're trying to place the features relative to one another. So I'm using a vertical to compare the corner of her right eye, so the inside corner of her right eye to the corner of the mouth. And then I use that relationship to place a line on the mouth and gauge that vertical distance relative to one another. I use this type of measurements a lot, but I only like to do these once I have the larger shapes established. That way I actually have something to work from to establish the positions in space. Again, I use the vertical to compare the inside corner of the eye to the outside corner of the nose. I use these relationships from one corner from one shape to one corner to the other shape using horizontals and using verticals. And in some instances, I look at distances such as the height of the eye. I use the measurement of the height of the eye to relate to the distance from the bottom of the nose to the top of the lip. I use these measurements relative to one another so that I can get more exacting shapes. Going back to the simple value scale I've already established, I'm using a little tiny size 1 brush to draw out the light on the eyeball, on the white of the eye known as the sclera. I'm going to be drawing out the shape of the light on the eye now that I have the big shape of the eye established. Again, going back to the value scale that we've already established, I'm going to be mixing up a mid-tone, a mid value to place the topmost portion of the eyelid. Um, I want to be able to carve into these forms and create them in a three-dimensional way. I'm going ahead and I'm going to lighten up the value underneath of the eye. I had it a little bit too dark in my initial marks, so I'm going to now further refine this large plane of value. Using a horizontal line, I'm going to be comparing the inside corner of her right eyebrow to the inside corner of her left eyebrow. And then once I have that distance established, I'll be using a vertical from the inside corner of her left eyebrow to the center of her mouth and the corner of the nose. So I'm going to be using these relationships relative to one another to place that eyebrow. Using that same value that I had for the eyebrow, I'm going to be carving out a flat value now for the bottom of the nose. So I'm just unifying what I had before so that I can go back in and further refine my light and shadow shapes. Going back to my value scale, I'm going to be now creating a value for the light portion of the nose to further refine the light and shadow shapes of the nose. Now take note that I'm using my value relationships on the palette before I put them onto the canvas. With the careful placement of the features and the accurate development of the shapes, now we can really start to refine the actual distinctions of the light and shadow shapes relative to one another on the smaller forms, such as the inside corners and the outside corners of the nose. It's really helpful to work these out with just values. Pulling things out sometimes and then carving them away with the eraser brush is sometimes a useful thing to do. Going back to my value scale, I'm going to go to the bottom of my value scale right now, and I'm going to place the dark accent of the inside of the nostril. Now, the nice thing about using a raw umber and white underpainting is that you're not really reaching your darkest dark yet. So once this dries, you're going to have a whole nother spectrum of values to work from. Now that I have the nose figured out, I'm going to be placing the lip now. I'm going to be solidifying the placement of the lip. So I'm going to go back to this measurement that I saw before. So the height of the eye, so the distance from the bottom of the eye to the top of the eye, is somewhat of a relationship to the bottom of the nose to the upper lip. So this is kind of the thought process that goes on in my head. So the distance of the bottom of the nose to the top of the mouth is somewhat like the distance of the top of the eye, that is the top of the eyelid to the bottom of the eyelid, but it's a little bit larger. That little bit that I just mentioned there is crucial to the accuracy of the placements of the features of the face. I'm really using my eye and I'm kind of relying on my intuition a little bit to gauge where that placement is. And then I went back to the vertical from the inside corner of the eye again to the outside corner of the mouth. I see that it's a little bit to the right, and then I'm going to be further refining the placement as I go. I have to step back periodically because the painting will look different to me 12 inches than it would look 12 feet away. And we really want to establish the way it looks 12 feet away or 10 feet away because that's really the distance that matters. That's the distance people are going to see it at first glance when they're staring at it in a museum or a gallery. Going back to my value scale on the palette, I'm going to be further refining the side plane of the face using the mid-tone that I've established on the palette. Now I'm treating this like a sculpture in a sense that I'm carving out just a flat area of value to create the illusion of a plane on a three-dimensional surface. Now remember I mentioned before that I'm not trying to render anything, I'm just trying to have some careful indications of form, and that's still what I'm doing. This flat value for the side of the face is just going to be an indication of a form. It's still not an attempt to render anything. I'm just trying to solidify the distinction between the planes of the face. Going back to the value scale again, I'm going to be mixing just one step darker from the value that I've already mixed previously. And I'm going to be using that to carve another plane, or chisel as you can think if you're thinking of it as a sculpture. So I'm carving out another plane that is turning more into the shadow. So this is often referred to as the dark light. The dark light is the darkest area of the light just as it creeps into the shadow. And even though this is how you create a three-dimensional form, so you could say that this is how you're going to render the painting, I'm using it for a different reason. I'm using it just to establish where the forms are so that for the next layer I have an understanding of the basic structures of the face as I go into color. Now I'm going to be softening the edges that I just created. So going back to the sculpture analogy, so we first carved out the major planes and now we're softening it. So you can think of this as kind of taking a thing of sandpaper and carving out more subtle variations of the planes on the face. So if this were a sculpture right now, this soft brush would be kind of like the sanding paper. So I'm not trying to soften too much, but I'm just softening enough so that I don't get any terribly hard edges on the light side of the face. And what I'm using to do that is a dry, soft sable brush. Now we'll be introducing yet another value to our value scale, and that's going to be the floor. That's going to be the darkest dark that I can get with raw umber. And remember that raw umber isn't straight black, and it isn't as dark as burnt umber, so it's going to give me a nice compressed value range so that once this dries I'll be able to further expand my value range. So I'm going to clean my large light brush. This is a size 4 brush, and I'm going to be just getting straight white and adding yet another value to the value scale. But I don't want to use straight white, so I'm going to get just a tad bit of the raw umber into the mixture so that I can create this next level value, this highest value. So this is my ceiling now to the value scale. And then I'm going to get my tiny brush, my size 1 brush, and I'm going to carefully put in the highlights. Sometimes if I want a small spot of light, I'll use the rear end of a brush because that is basically a flat dot, and then I use that sometimes to create a little dot of light. Thanks again for watching this week's portrait painting demonstration. Stay tuned for next week's episode where we take this painting and we push it a little bit further by introducing color and refining the forms a little bit. Thanks again.